I was held not even in town, but somewhere in the Somali bush. I had already met a couple of other hostages from the Seychelles, and we were just sort of languishing in the bush when one of the pirate guards came up and said, "Time for a phone call." Okay. So I went up to the bluff, and there were two men up there who I now recognize as top pirate bosses, but one of them had a pistol in his hand. They said, "Call someone." I said, "Well, you guys took my backpack. I have all the phone numbers in my backpack. Bring me my things." They said, "Call someone." Jeez. I was there on a grant from the Pulitzer Center on crisis reporting, so I should have called them in Washington, D.C. The only phone number I had in my head was my mother's. So I called Mom.
Great. That was Michael Scott Moore. I'm Jamie Brisick. This is Soundings, brought to you by the Surfers Journal. The Surfers Journal is a member-supported publication made possible by sponsorship from Birdwell, FCS, Patagonia, Rainbow, Vans, Vissla, and Yeti. More like a book than a magazine, TSJ brings you 128 pages of independent storytelling every 8 weeks, covering the people, culture, travel, and art of surfing. To learn more or to subscribe, please visit surfersjournal.com. I first encountered Michael Scott Moore in a New York Times review of his book, Sweetness and Blood: How Surfing Spread from California and Hawaii to the Rest of the World, with some unexpected results. It was a favorable review, and Sweetness and Blood was named a best book of 2010 by The Economist and Pop Matters. Then I read that Michael had been abducted in Somalia while working on a book about piracy. This was in 2012. The gang holding Michael subsequently demanded $20 million for his release. Michael was held captive for 2.5 years and released on September 22, 2014. Michael has published 3 books, including the novel Too Much of Nothing, the nonfiction history of surfing Sweetness and Blood, and The Desert and the Sea, about his abduction in Somalia. He worked as the theater columnist for the SF Weekly until he moved to Berlin, Germany in 2005. In Germany, he worked as both a staff and a freelance editor for Spiegel Online International. His journalism has been published in the Atlantic Monthly, the New Republic, the LA Times, and the New Yorker. Michael lives in the South Bay of Los Angeles, where he grew up surfing. We spoke at my studio in Malibu. So, Michael, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. Good to be here.
So we begin in Hamburg. Can we start from there and kind of take us through?
Sure. So I was living in Berlin for a number of years before I started to follow this pirate story, not just in the water off Somalia, from the newsroom in Berlin, but also as a trial in Europe. There was all of a sudden a trial of 10 Somali pirates in front of a judge in Hamburg. And that was a fairly big deal in Europe because it was the first time there were pirates in front of a German judge in something like 400 years. So all this was very new and very unusual to Germans. And I was writing about it for Spiegel Online, but in English, so it had an international audience, kind of an American audience. But I realized really quickly that it was going to be a story that would be somewhat new to Americans. It was almost like the way the cargo ship that was taken by pirates was boarded had a lot in common with the Captain Phillips story. The way it ended was not quite as dramatic, but the Dutch Navy did come in and free the ship, and the crew was not captive for very long. And then all of a sudden there were 10 Somalis in Germany. And so I followed the story of 10 pirates in Germany for about a year, going back and forth from Berlin, where I lived, up to Hamburg, where the trial was, on the train. And it was fascinating. I mean, it was a really interesting process, but also it became kind of a bureaucratic and dysfunctional process. And then the longer it dragged on, the more I got my act together about going to Somalia. I mean, I met people through the trial who seemed to be able to guarantee some safety, who had brought other journalists down there. And on the Horn of Africa, I had already met a documentary maker who lived in Germany, who was interested in doing a project with me, or going down there to report alongside me and doing separate projects. And so that's what we began to organize. This guy was named Ashwin Rahman. He's an Indian-born journalist, but he'd been living in Germany for a long time. And we really hit it off when we met down in Djibouti a year or so before the trial. And we organized a trip. And before that trial in Hamburg even ended, we went down to Somalia in the first days of 2012.
Okay.
First, we went to Nairobi, got our act together, met our fixer, who was a Somali elder living in Berlin, and he was from that clan that would be relevant in the town where we wanted to go to. The town was called Galkayo, and that was where about 5 of the 10 pirates were from. And that was an interesting town because it wasn't on the coast, but it was a pirate town inland. It was almost like a pirate metropolis, except that it was a smallish city. The kind of place where pirate bosses set up their villas, where they could get alcohol if they wanted to in a Muslim society, where they could buy women if they needed to, and where they could resupply their pirates on the coast. So that was the place that we were going to start and do most of our reporting.
Okay.
So that's what we did. We went down for 10 days to 2 weeks in Somalia. That was the original plan. After 10 days, Ashwin decided he'd had enough material. We both got plenty of material. We even made an excursion out to the coast, Hobyo, which was a known pirate town. And everything seemed to be going well. We didn't, in the sense that we didn't get captured when we went out to Hobyo. So when he was finished, he decided to get on a plane to Mogadishu, which was a slight departure. We were going to go in and out of Somalia together via Nairobi. And he decided he wanted to gather some material in Mogadishu. And so we set up a trip to the airport. And that morning, the trip to the airport started to fall apart. Something went wrong with our security team. And the way we understood it, the president, the local regional president, the high-ranking guy in the Somali clan who had hosted us, in a sense, sent his car instead, and we rode in his car. I mean, it seemed like a pretty good second option. But as it turned out, once Ashwin got on the plane and left, I was left in this car with not enough security. And the guys that were taking me around, I mean, the elder from Berlin and our other fixers. But it was a pretty vulnerable way to drive around. And on our way back from the airport that morning, there was a battle wagon, a technical, sort of a flatbed truck with a big gun in the back, waiting for us by the side of the road. And that group of Somalis in the back saw our car. First of all, they aimed the big cannon at our car, overpowered my guard, and about 10 of their guards came and ripped me out of the car. So they fired into the air. They ripped open the door. I tried to hold the door closed. They beat on my right wrist with their Kalashnikovs, broke my wrist, bloodied my scalp, and pulled me out into the dust. And then when they had taken my things, my backpack, they bundled me into another SUV that was waiting, and then we drove off into the bush. And from then on, I was a pirate hostage.
So when they pulled you out of the car, did you have any sense that they knew who you were?
Yeah, I was pretty sure that they were after us. And in fact, in not just the first few weeks, but the first few months, every now and then I heard a question, where's the other journalist? Where's them, meaning Ashwin? They had been hoping that they would get us both. And now that I've talked to a bunch of, now that I'm out and I've talked to a bunch of people, I actually think they were trying to get us on the way up, and we happened to take a different detour, or a different route up to the airport. And so they were a little bit surprised to find only one of us in the car.
2 years and 8 months you were held. So at that moment, did you think this could be the end of my life? At this moment, did you think in 2 days I'm going to be out of here, or we're going to grease their palms and I'm going to be out? Did you have any idea of the magnitude of what was about to begin?
Well, it's incredible how powerful optimism is. As soon as I got caught, I thought, well, Ashwin's going to land in Mogadishu, and the first thing he's going to do is, call people he knows in both governments. I'm a German as well as an American citizen, and I'm going to get rescued within a week or something. This will all get taken care of because Ashwin knows people. Bullshit. I mean, not really. What did happen was that there were some FBI agents at my mother's door within 12 hours. I mean, the American government did respond very quickly, but not with guns. And in fact, within 4 days of my capture, another pair of Western hostages, an American and a Norwegian, who had been held in Somalia for I think 3 months. They were rescued by an American SEAL team. And that was actually something I was not, when I say how hope works, before I went to Somalia, I was not counting on any kind of an American action on Somali soil because I knew that the U.S. military had been very shy of doing stuff like that ever since Black Hawk Down. So when I heard about it, and it took a while, but when I heard about what happened with these two hostages, I thought, oh my gosh, so that actually could happen. That is something that the Americans could do. So, your mind becomes very contradictory in a situation like that. I was incredibly and ridiculously hopeful, and at the same time, I knew that the odds were against any kind of quick resolution.
When the FBI goes and knocks on your mom's door and says your son is being held hostage in Somalia, had there already been this sort of here's where we're setting the ransom to release him? How did they know that you'd been taken in?
No, I think that was strictly a result of phone calls that Ashwin made. So he found out as soon as he landed in Mogadishu, which is only 3 hours later, right? That that I'd been kidnapped. Our fixer would have called him. He would have called whoever he knew in both governments, and in Washington, they would have called some field agents in Redondo Beach, where my mother lives. So, it's remarkable how quickly that happened. But at that point, they didn't know anything about where I was or what the captors wanted. There was no ransom. I was held hostage for a week before I even got on the phone with anyone I knew. And that struck me as a really long time.
Yeah. And so your first phone call, how did that go?
Well, by then I was held not even in town, but somewhere in the Somali bush. I had already met a couple of other hostages from the Seychelles, and we were just sort of languishing in the bush when one of the pirate guards came up and said, "Time for a phone call." Okay, I guess that's good. It was so eerie and quiet, it was hard to tell. But first, Rolly, that was the name of the fisherman from the Seychelles, went up to the top of this bluff and made a phone call, and he came back all dejected. He's like, "Oh, geez, my family in the Seychelles, they said they don't have the money, they can't afford it, and maybe you're going to have to die in Somalia." Like, geez, that doesn't sound good. So I went up to the bluff after him, and there were two men up there who I now recognize as top pirate bosses, but one of them had a pistol in his hand. The other kind of made the demands, and if I balked at the demands, the guy with the pistol wagged his pistol, and actually he pointed it straight into my face at one point. They said, "Call someone." I said, "Well, you guys took my backpack. I have all the phone numbers in my backpack. Bring me my things." They said, "Call someone." Jeez. I was there on a grant from the Pulitzer Center on crisis reporting, so I should have called them in Washington, D.C. The only phone number I had in my head was my mother's. So I called Mom.
Great. Of course.
But like I said, this was a week after the kidnapping. So I wasn't sure if she knew about it. I wasn't sure. I could tell right away from the way she responded that she did know about it, and she'd been expecting the call. Then I mentioned the amount of money that the pirates wanted. I mean, the discussion with these two gentlemen on the bluff resulted in a demand of $20 million. That's when I laughed, and that's when the one guy with the pistol waved his weapon in my face. So I said, "Well, Mom, they want $20 million. And she went silent. I mean, that was not something she was prepared for. She's like, "Where am I supposed to get $20 million? I'm like, "I have no idea, and I don't think it's an entirely serious demand." But they held on to that demand. I mean, they did not negotiate for the first 9 months of my captivity. So they made this ridiculous demand, and then they didn't move. They didn't budge. which was my first indication that these guys weren't even very good kidnappers.
So in that 9 months, are you you're being held somewhere? What is the day to day at that point?
Well, for the first 3 months, it was a pretty predictable movement between the bush and some sort of a house in a town that turned out to be Hobyo. At first, I wasn't sure. Everything was very confusing. As soon as you stepped into an SUV with pirates, you didn't know where you were going. There was a lot of dust, and you drove through the bush until you got somewhere. And listening to the pirates was actually distracting. I had the idea that I was in Haradere, which is a smaller town, fishing village south of Hobyo, strictly based on what they were saying in Somali. But it turns out that I was probably in Hobyo, and when I wasn't in Hobyo, they took me and Rolly out into the bush. So it was like camping out in the middle of nowhere, maybe under a tree, always out in the dusty waste. And the Somali guards who surrounded us would build a campfire, and that's how they made our tea. It was pretty rudimentary.
So what's going on in your mind at this point? I mean, you probably have no idea whether the money's being produced, whether that's going to come through. You probably had no idea how long this was going to go. You would have had to have been in a kind of hyper present in the sense of you had no idea how this thing's going to end,
Yeah. In those first several months, I was not immersed in the present so much as frantic about how I was going to get out. So every time we went someplace new, I didn't have glasses, so my eyesight wasn't very good. But to the best that I could, I tried to case the joint, and see where I could escape if I had to, or if at all possible. And while we were camped out there in the bush, there did seem to be sort of one way. If I went out to pee, where I could just start running. But I knew that what I might find in the Somali bush might be completely unpredictable. In other words, I would probably find a nomad camp and some people who may or may not have the pirate's phone number. Not necessarily friendly people.
Yeah.
And not necessarily a long-distance truck I could flag down or anything like that. Probably herders. And once I started to run, I would be chased by people who were actually quite adept trackers. I had already heard stories about women in Somali society or girls who were trying to escape being, cut. The female circumcision is a really controversial thing there. And even before I got captured, I heard this incredible and horrible story about a girl who tried to get out of it, and she ran from her village, but she came from a society of trackers, so they could find her. They knew how to track her footprints. And I'm like, I don't really want to be in that position either.
So you're kind of in this suspense of is the money going to come through, and am I going to be freed, or is this going to escalate into something worse?
Yeah, I think I realized from the $20 million demand that it wasn't going to end anytime soon, unless it was ended by force or by me figuring out some sort of escape route. But within maybe, and the interesting thing is that almost immediately there were surveillance planes overhead, and they scared the pirates. So within about 3 months, I think the pirates got sick of that. They got sick of having to move me every so often. They got sick of hearing drones or big planes overhead. So the wider gang, every pirate gang is also a network. The wider network captured a ship on the high seas, anchored it off Hobyo so that we could see it. And by the end of that was probably after 2 months, and by the end of the third month, we were on board that ship. So they placed me and Rolly, one of the two Seychelles guys, on board the ship, and the ship was our home for that summer. This is the summer of 2012. And that turned out to be a really life-changing experience. I mean, very few Western journalists I think no Western journalists saw life aboard a ship hijacked by Somali pirates, even if they were captured by Somali pirates. But the pirates put me on board this ship probably to consolidate their guard crews. And this was a 50-meter tuna vessel run by a Taiwanese company, Taiwanese and I think an Omani businessman, and crewed by about 28 guys from Southeast Asia, East and Southeast Asia. Some of them were Chinese. And that was a fascinating experience.
And were they all being sort of held hostage aboard?
They were all hostages, yeah. Their ship was hijacked late at night at the end of March, and we were on board by April. Yeah, and they had no idea what was going on. They were fresher hostages than we were, and they were all young kids from around Southeast Asia, from, rice-growing villages in Cambodia and Vietnam and China and the Philippines. And that was a whole sort of prison society on board. And they could barely talk to each other because they had no common language except this onboard pidgin that they had developed, which we then had to learn. And we had to find our way into this society that was already kind of set in its ways. It was like I said, it was like a prison society. And I noticed pretty quickly that even though everybody was very sweet-tempered, they didn't like each other. There was a lot of nationalist tension and competition for resources is what that turned out to be. And so we had to find our way into that. And by the end of the summer, we were all friends, but it was tense at first.
Were you able to roam freely obviously there's nowhere you could go unless you jumped overboard into the ocean. Were you able to roam freely, or was it a thing where you were sort of like shackled, beneath in the...
No, we weren't shackled, but we were restricted to one work deck up front, the largest work deck, which was only maybe 40 by 40 feet. And then kind of a, what you might call the forecastle, the covered area in the front of the ship. And we just had to pile in there. And at least for the first few nights, we all slept outdoors on mats. And when we first boarded at night, my first impression was of all these Asian guys arranged like dominoes on the deck. And that's how we slept until, I don't know, a week in or so, 5 days in. The pirates decided to put 10 of us in the cabins. So it became a ritual that after dinner and showers in the evening, we would line up and go up to our beds, about 10 of us. And that was a bunch of Chinese guys, a couple of Vietnamese guys, Rolly from the Seychelles, and me. And I don't know how they selected us, but we would go and sleep in these bunks. And then after 5 or 6 in the morning, we would come out and sit on deck again. And that was our routine.
Wow. And I'm curious, where do you go in your mind to sort of preserve your sanity in a situation like this? I mean, the anxiety, I would imagine, could just run so out of control.
Oh, yeah.
So are you deep breathing? Are you doing meditation, yoga? Are you remembering great moments from your life? I would imagine.
Remembering your life is a big one. When I was still out in the bush, not on the ship, there was really nothing to do. And so Rolly and I couldn't even talk for that long. So, during the day, there would be long hours where you would just be alone with your thoughts. And I'm sure that at that point I was still thinking, when I get out, I'll write my book and I will, say this and that. And I got to remember this for the next time I have a notebook and everything like that. My mind was, it was still fresh and it was still eager to do something with all this horrible but new material. And eventually I was less like that. Eventually I was pretty fatalistic about getting out at all, and I didn't think that I was going to get out. But in those early months, your mind went everywhere. On the ship, there were lots of people to talk to. So there were 28 guys to get to know. It was always a little bit more interesting than just being alone or semi-alone on land.
Yeah.
And the food was better on the ship. We were anchored over a coral reef. We could catch all kinds of fantastic fish just by hand using hand lines, never mind the long line that the ship had. That was not in service. And there was a lot of frozen tuna in the hold, too. So we were getting good, fresh seafood. There was still food in the ship's kitchen, and we were eating pretty well compared to the dog food that the pirates fed us on land.
And are you getting any kind of
updates as to where things sit, or is it just this sort of day to day, and you're just you're sitting there going, have no idea what's happening back in the U.S. and where the money's being compiled, put together?
No clue. There were in retrospect, those first 9 months or so where negotiations were going nowhere were riddled with phone calls. I mean, we did have a phone call every few weeks, which still didn't seem like nearly enough. But I'm like, why are we sitting here? Why are we not on the phone negotiating or something? So I assumed things were going on in the background, but every time someone came aboard, there had to be a translator who did not live on the ship, who would come aboard with a phone and who could set up a phone call. And I didn't like him, but I was always happy to see him. And then we would do these phone calls that led nowhere. In effect, it was the pirates proving that they still had me, and whatever negotiations were happening, outside of those phone calls. But every few weeks, I got the word that the ransom still stood at $20 million. So.
Did you do anything to keep track of time passing? The classic scene would be someone in their prison cell and they do a little X for every day that passes.
Right. Well, the ship had a paper calendar. So there was a calendar where it's, one of those, it was a big calendar actually, one sheet per day. And it had the date in Chinese and in English and probably another language or two. And the men kept track of the date that way. And so every morning, actually, the sheet from that day, or maybe the previous day, would go from hand to hand. But at some point, there was a fist fight in the corner where the calendar was over which day it was. So
Wow.
Eventually, nobody was quite sure.
Wow.
But as long as I was on the ship, I think I was probably aware of the date within a couple of days. After that, it got much worse.
Jeez, God, it's so fascinating to me because I think of if you're a prison inmate, if you're doing life, you at least know you're doing life. If you're doing, 6 months, you've kind of got this countdown, and you're sort of in this limbo, this kind of like, I have no idea where this is going to go.
That was the worst part. You had no idea when it might end. Yeah.
Yeah. So what did you do to, so chatting with fellow hostages, did you play cards? Did you find games or those other things like that?
Yeah, those guys all became smokers as soon as they were kidnapped. So as soon as the ship was hijacked, they started to rely on the ship's store of cigarettes that were in the deep freeze. And so every now and then these cigarette cartons would come out of the freezer. All the men would line up for their little cartons of cigarettes, and they all smoked. I smoked every now and then, but there was so much cigarette cardboard lying around that we would actually make decks of cards out of it. There were some pens too.
Wow.
And then we'd play solitaire or whatever.
Jeez.
But fishing was a good, and then you could do pull-ups, you could do yoga, whatever.
Yep. And so a big part of this story, and I'm going to mispronounce it, but there's something that the Somali pirates are chewing every day to get
Khat.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the khat, they're getting high. Explain for our listeners what khat is.
Khat is it's a leaf. It's actually a narcotic leaf, but the immediate effect is that it gives you a buzz. I mean, I think it's the effect is a little bit more like coca leaf, which is not a narcotic. But with khat, you get, if you chew enough of it, the Somalis would sit in front of a pile of khat leaf and chew for hours. It keeps them buzzing for hours, and especially if they were on a night vigil, that's how they stayed awake. The problem is that once you crash and for another, hours long session, and then you wake up depressed and you need more khat. So, but this stuff arrived in a massive bundle once per day by skiff from land, came bouncing across the water, and a few of the guys who were hostages, actually, they started a khat chewing circle too, and the pirates were happy to give them a handful every day.
Did you try it?
I did. Oh yeah, I did. I didn't get addicted to it, but I tried it every now and then. The pirates, they loved getting foreigners high. They thought khat was just the best thing on earth.
Wow.
But khat is one reason Somalia is in such terrible shape. I mean, it makes you extremely lazy.
Okay. And where does khat come from?
The highlands of Kenya and Ethiopia. So it needs mountain kind of atmosphere to grow. It doesn't grow in the desert. But for some reason, people in desert climates like Yemen and Somalia, where there are also Muslims and can't drink alcohol. That's where it's popular. You can find it in Kenya, but a lot of it is exported from Kenya to Somalia.
Okay. Does that helicopter flying overhead do anything to you?
No. When I first got out of Somalia, I have to say, when I was in Berlin, every time I heard a plane land at Tegel Airport, that did something to me, because every time I heard a plane in Somalia, I knew it was for me, right? There were very few big planes that were landing, as a regular course of air traffic. There was a cot flight that landed in Galkayo every morning around 6, but that wasn't a huge plane. But when I heard a big, let's say, a C-130 circling, I thought, well, those are Americans looking for me. And the pirates felt the same way. So when I heard a jetliner land in Berlin, my ears perked up. I mean, I went straight there for the first 6 months easily.
And did that kind of bring out this hope that you, was it something to hang on to?
When I was still in Berlin, it's still in Somalia, absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Every time, sometimes you could hear drones too. And every time I heard aircraft, for the first time in my life, I was pro-drone, right? Every time I heard any kind of unusual aircraft, especially if it made the pirates terrified, it put me in a better mood.
So the guards are chewing cot. They're willing to share it. They're happy to get you high. What was your relationship like with the guards, given how much time you would spend with them in the end?
Well, up to that point, so with those first few months on land and then the 6 months or so on the ship, I didn't interact with the guards that much. There were a few that I got to know that wanted to talk to me. So we got to be friendly, but I would say I didn't get to be friends with any of the guards or get to be even conversational with more than 2 or 3 of them until after the ship. Because after I left the Naham 3, I was held basically alone with no other hostages to talk to. And nothing but a guard team. So those guys were bored too, and the Somalis wanted to talk to me because they didn't, they got sick of each other too. So,
what would you talk about?
Sometimes they asked me about America or about Europe. Sometimes they asked me to draw a map of Europe because they were thinking about getting out of Somalia. They wanted to know where the Netherlands was compared to France, for example. I asked them about their religion to find out whether because these guys prayed 5 times a day. They were very devout, or they thought they were. And I wanted to find out whether they really thought they were being good Muslims. And it turns out there are a couple of verses in the Quran that they really did think would absolve them. Wow. In other words, there are some verses about kidnapping an infidel that make it sound like it's perfectly okay, and they belong to something called the verses of the sword that some Muslims use to justify jihad. And so some of these guys really thought they were fighting jihad by holding a foreigner, holding an infidel. So those things were interesting. I couldn't have learned that stuff when I was in a group of hostages, because I probably wouldn't have sat down to talk to a guard for that long to learn about his religious beliefs or learn more about his background. So sometimes I asked, where did you grow up? Have you been out on the water as a pirate? Where else have you been? Sometimes the answer was Djibouti or even Libya, which is interesting. So things like that.
Yep. You've talked about forgiving the guards. Tell me, how did that go? I mean, I guess it's the classic "don't kill the messenger" thing, right? I mean, they're just simply doing their job. They're not necessarily the ones who...
Well, I mean, the short answer is yes, but I think the important thing for me psychologically... So remember, I was held for 2 years and 8 months, and I would say for the first 2 years of it, it was nothing but mental strain. I mean, I was angry most of the time. All of us were. And when I was alone with Somalis after the ship, and it was nothing but me and the pirates, in a series of prison houses on land where, the sun baked and nothing was comfortable and the food was terrible. I was angry most of the time. So the only way to relieve that at some point was either to pick up a gun, which is something I thought about more than once, because the guards were careless about leaving their Kalashnikovs around, blast my way out, or to escape. That was constantly on my mind. That tension had to resolve itself some way. And if it had gone on much longer, without some resolution, I probably would have done something stupid. Trying to shoot the guards when there are 10 of them would have been suicidal. And in fact, I was suicidal too. In phases, I also thought about just grabbing a gun and shooting myself. So one resolution to that was to make a conscious decision to forgive these guys. And that was a question of forgiving the people who were right in front of me, making my life miserable, or seeming to make my life miserable every day. And in fact, even when somebody's making your life miserable, you have a choice. This is a Stoic idea too, but there is some room, there is a little bit of freedom for you to react to those people and to that situation without making yourself miserable. And that's what I discovered when I actually decided. It was something I heard on the radio, the Pope talking about forgiveness, but that jogged it. But I found that when I actually sat down to approach it differently in my mind and consciously forgive these guys who were walking around me with guns, that I woke up in a much better mood. Now, forgiveness is not the same thing as forgetting, right? I haven't forgotten what happened, and I don't think that I need to. In fact, when I was writing the book, it was very important to get all the details right and be a good witness to what happened.
Yeah.
Because I needed that relationship with those memories.
Yes.
The worst thing you could do is stuff all that stuff into a hole and pretend it didn't happen or not think about it again. You need some communication with that aspect of your life. And that's probably true about anything traumatic.
Did you feel sort of this weight lift off of you once you kind of made it through that?
When I made that decision in Somalia, in one of the prison houses, it was like night and day, actually.
Yeah.
It was a whole different way to approach this miserable situation.
So fascinating, because I think those aphorisms are out there all the time, but rarely are we actually faced with it to that extreme, where it becomes such a, it's such a big thing that can make all the difference.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. At any point, did they say, "Can we get you anything?" And you said, "Yes, I'd like a pen and I'd like a notebook."
Yeah, that happened a couple of times. So sometimes they just had pens and notebooks, and they were lying around, and I would pilfer one and then grab a pen and say, "Okay," and they're like, "I don't care," because they were keeping track of their cot debts, as a matter of fact, in these notebooks. But if it wasn't a crucial notebook, then I could keep it. What always happened was I sat down, wrote about what was happening, named names, and kept a journal. And within weeks or months, the guards would get sick of that and they would take my notes. So I had journals, daily journals, confiscated twice.
Okay.
And then the third time that I got my hands on a pen and paper, a pen and a notebook, would have been sometime in 2013, I think. And to preserve what I was writing, or maybe not to raise suspicion, I decided not to keep a journal. I was no longer confident I was going to get out. I wasn't thinking about a book anymore. I started to write fiction just to keep my mind occupied. And they, sure enough, they came around and checked what I was writing. And they're like, what is this, a made-up story about some fish? I'm like, yep. Like, we don't even know why you're doing this. And as it turned out, I left Somalia with 6 notebooks and a partially drafted novel.
Wow.
And by the way, if something did happen, I would note it, but in German, so they couldn't read it.
I see.
And in a very, very cramped hand without spelling out anyone's name. So I did leave with some notes too. But when I came out and sat down to work on the memoir, I wondered if I had enough detail just in my memory to write the book.
And did you find that you did?
I had more than enough.
Yeah. And what was the process of writing the memoir like? Was it the cliched question would be, was it a cathartic experience? Did it
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of cliches around the therapeutic aspect of writing. I don't think that just sitting down to emote on the page is the therapeutic thing. In retrospect, I think it was sitting down to organize the story. to structure the book. That was actually therapeutic, and that's not an emotional thing, right? That's a rational thing that your mind does. But I think that was more therapeutic, if anything, because that's what you're doing in talk therapy too. You're doing nothing but creating a narrative out of something that might be extremely chaotic and confusing and painful to think about.
Yeah.
So you're ordering it in some way.
Yeah. Okay, so we've gone into the writing of the book, this sort of reflecting back on the whole thing. But can you tell us about how did it end? How did it end? How'd you get out?
Yeah. Well, I went for a long time with no phone calls. So at some point, probably in 2013, the pirates said, no more phone calls with your family. And so that was a miserable span of time. And then at some point in late 2014, I noticed that the phone calls had started up again. And as they became more frequent, I seemed to glean that there were negotiations moving. I didn't know details, but there was now a new. It was no longer just my mom on the phone. There was a new negotiator. I didn't quite know who he was. For all I knew, he was trying to case the situation to send in some special operators or something. But I was very nervous. But there was one morning where I was on the phone to this negotiator whose name was Bob, and he said, have the pirates told you what's going on? I said, no, not at all. And the pirate grabbed the phone out of my hand. He said, proof of life only. I thought, well, that was weird.
Wow.
And then later after breakfast, the pirates said, Michael, you're going free. I'm like, you guys keep telling me that. I don't believe you. I had stopped hoping, right? So I didn't believe them. And then I went to the bathroom after lunch or something like that, and I heard a car come into the compound, which normally happened only at night. And while I was still in the bathroom, one of the guards was, by the door with a gun in his hand. He said, "Michael, your car is here in Somali." Like, what car? What do you mean? And then they started to say, pack up, you're going to go. And I thought, well, it sounds like something really is happening, but they probably just sold me to some worse group. I'm probably going to spend another year in Somalia. And then they started handing money around. There was a bundle of money, which should have told me that I was I'd been ransomed. I thought, these guys just sold me to Al-Shabaab or something, some terrorists. My life's about to get much worse. I started to like the guards or some of them. I didn't want to be in the hands of a whole new group of Somalis. And then they said, you can get in the car. We're going to take you out. First they said to the airport and then out into the bush. And the changing story didn't help my mood either. I got very angry about that. And then they took me out into the bush, transferred me to another car. I noticed that there was only one person in that car and he did not have a gun. I thought, this is actually a pretty good development. And that person said that he could put me on the phone with my mom. And when he did, my mom, who had listened to that phone call early in the morning, said that, was then on the phone with me in the car. She said that the tone of my voice was like night and day. That by then I knew I was going free, and that car, I think there was one more transfer of cars, and then those cars brought me to the airport where I'd said goodbye to Ashwin 2.5 years before, and waiting for me at the airport was a small bush plane and a pilot named Derek, who got me out of there. We pulled up in an SUV. I stepped out of the SUV. He took a picture of me from under the wing of his plane. He said, "A picture for your mother."
Wow.
I said, "You must be Derek." And I think I say in the book, In the Desert and the Sea, that he was the first competent man I had seen in 2 years.
Wow.
He actually knew what he was doing. He could fly the plane, first of all, and he had a certain, wit, a certain sense of humor about him. And that had been sorely lacking in my life for the previous 2 years.
So Derek flies you to where?
Only to Mogadishu. So
Okay.
after 3 or 4 hours in the air in Derek's little plane, a turbulent flight, I'm still not out of Somalia, but I landed in a kind of a secure part of the Mogadishu airport, and within 20 minutes, another very big plane, an Air Force C-130, landed. And that plane eventually took me to Nairobi.
And who was on? Were you the only person on the plane, or was there?
No, on the big plane?
Yeah.
No, it was crewed with a lot of Air Force people.
Okay.
And then there were also American FBI and German BND.
So at this point,
Types.
you're in the clear. You're home effectively.
Yeah. No, I mean, I was in the hands of the U.S. military and law enforcement. And first, they were really nice to me. Actually, they were always very nice to me. But, they didn't ask me too many questions until I was safe on the ground in Nairobi.
Mm-hmm. So the Tom Hanks version of the story, there are high fives. There's hugs. What was it really
Nothing like that. It was actually not like that. I was so far gone as far as my mood was concerned that I was not in any condition to celebrate. My mom heard it in the tone of my voice, but I was not cheering.
Yeah.
I thought, what had to happen to get me out of here?
Yeah.
I wondered what the cost was.
Mm-hmm.
It felt rotten to think that so many people had to work so hard to get me out.
Mm-hmm.
But when I landed in Nairobi, they put me up in a nice house, in a kind of a guest house in the backyard of a German official who was living in the suburbs of Nairobi. So it was a beautiful sort of situation, and I stayed there for 2 or 3 days to recuperate.
Mm-hmm.
There were some American and German, FBI types. The German BND is like the FBI. They asked me a little bit about what went on, and then they flew me home to Berlin,
mm-hmm.
and we did a great deal of debriefing and talking about the story from start to finish. And I mean, they couldn't have been nicer, but that phase, those 2 or 3 days in Nairobi were really important because I could take a shower, shave, eat well.
Yeah.
What
was the thing you missed most? What was the thing that you were your body had craved that you hadn't had in 2 years and 8 months?
Well, so the German host asked me that, and I said, "Do you have a beer?" He said, "I have a fridge full of German beer." And he said, hostages, whenever they get out, if they're male, the first thing they ask for is beer. I didn't ask what the women asked for. But beer was certainly one thing. A hot shower, being able to shave when I wanted to. So all those things that I could do in Nairobi in the first few days. What else? A burger. I think I got a burger pretty quickly. Just decent food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And one thing that happened while I was there was I started to fantasize about food. I started to dream up recipes, and this is in the book, In the Desert and the Sea. One thing I started to note down in my notebooks was how I would cook this or that thing that I was craving. And so after Somalia, I became a more creative cook.
Interesting.
Because when I wanted something, I could dream it up. I could imagine the ingredients, and before that, I relied on recipes and stuff like that. I became a much more creative cook afterwards.
Food is such a huge deal in terms of our well-being and our mood.
It's incredible.
Yeah. Can I ask, what was the ransom? How did the 20 mil?
My mom talked him down to 1.6 million. Like I said, there was another negotiator there at the end who actually closed the deal. He stepped in, but Bob. But my mom did most of the discussions, Mm-hmm. She had advice from some important people on how to go about the negotiations, but she was the one who did it on the phone.
Yep. And you're an only child, so when you finally saw your mom, was she in Berlin? Did you see her back in California?
Yeah, she flew out to Berlin. She was flown out to Berlin. We had a big family reunion in Berlin, actually, so her brother and sister came out, too, from other parts of Germany. And they were all in a hotel, and that's where we had a big family reunion. Yeah, it was very emotional.
Oh, man. Wow.
And because in the meantime, my grandmother had died, so their mother, or their stepmother, actually. But and I had gleaned that while I was in Somalia. I had a bad premonition about that. Mm-hmm. But the reasons I gleaned that were not related to what actually happened. It was very strange. So there was a lot, to catch up on.
Yeah. In the 2 years and 8 months, did you, in a kind of witness way, did you observe your mind do something that you never could have imagined? I mean, you talk about kind of gleaning your grandmother's passing. Was there anything, given we think about, we have this sort of, most of us have this idea of like solitary confinement. We see it in films. Mm-hmm. We imagine being held in a room by ourselves. You experienced something so extreme that, you're the first person I've ever known that's been a hostage in Somalia. was there something where you think back and go, wow, I didn't know that was inside of me to do that thing that was a survival mechanism, let's say?
Well, the forgiveness under duress was one thing, but just the sheer, just surviving periods. So the sheer stamina, I didn't know I had that.
Yeah.
You know, the idea that my circuits stayed more or less in shape under so much pressure. I mean, under so much pressure of anger.
Yeah.
You know, it was, like I said, it lasted at least 2 years. And then to realize that a lot of that pressure was self-imposed. So like I said, there's always a freedom that we have, which is to respond to whatever situation we find ourselves in. We can't always get out of a horrible situation, but we can decide how we respond to it. And like the Stoics say, a great deal of your suffering is self-imposed. It's all about the thoughts in your head and how your mind responds to it. And you have a great deal of control over how your mind responds to something. All those faculties I didn't know about. Maybe I knew about them in theory, but I didn't know how they worked, and I didn't know that I had them in working order.
That's great. Before we shift gears, anything that I didn't touch on that you'd like to? But okay.
No, nothing that I can think of.
Okay. How did you get into surfing?
I mean, I don't know. I was a boogie board kid for a long time, and then we actually moved out to the beach when I was 12 after my father died. And by the time I was 14, I was surfing. I mean, that was just a natural progression from boogie boards to surfboards. But it took a long time. I mean, I remember that summer. It took me a while to learn to stand up on the board. So I don't know how people go to surf camps and just pick it up. For us, it was just something that you did during the summer, and it was a natural progression from boogie boarding.
Yep. And was this in the South Bay? Were you there?
Yeah. So we moved from the valley to Manhattan Beach, Redondo Beach.
And how old were you when you moved to the South Bay, Manhattan?
12.
Okay. Yeah. Were you a skateboarder at all?
Yeah. I went skating now and then in the valley, yeah. Not a hardcore skateboarder.
Uh-huh. So at that time, the kind of heroes of the South Bay, Mike Purpose would have been sort of past his prime a little bit.
Yeah.
You would have had Chris Frohoff, Ted Robinson.
All those guys.
Yeah.
And Chris Wells.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you started, in that area. Did you start traveling up and down the coast of California, the usual kind of thing, trips to Baja?
Not till later. Later in high school, yes. I came up here to Malibu. I went down to San Diego and Orange County. But then I went to college at UCSD, and then from there I made trips to Baja and stuff like that.
At UCSD, were you a regular at Blacks?
Yes.
Yeah.
That was the whole point of going to UCSD.
UCSD is what a beautiful campus. I can't believe all the eucalyptus trees, and then Blacks right there, and La Jolla Shores and Scripps. And what were you studying at UCSD?
I started out studying biology, but I wound up studying German Lit.
Okay.
First of all, I took all the good biology classes. I kind of cored out the major, and then I didn't want to take the, physics and whatever were prerequisites. But also, it turned out to have a very good German Lit department. Nobody knew that, and nobody knows that. But the guy who ran it, who's now dead, was a brilliant German novelist called Reinhard Lettau.
Okay.
And he had been brought to San Diego by Herbert Marcuse, and he belonged to that whole Frankfurt school. But he was also he was simply a poet. He was a minimalist and a brilliant German stylist. But even today, not very many people know about him in Germany. He's still kind of an obscure name in German literature, except for the young writers who want to learn to be funny, because he was one of those rare German writers who could be funny in the vein of, Beckett. And German writers still to this day, in spite of Günter Grass and a few other people, need permission to be funny if they want to be taken seriously as writers.
Right. Were you always a reader from a young age? Yeah. And when did you start writing?
Probably in high school. I started to write for the school paper, and I was on the school paper at Miracosta, the La Vista staff, the school newspaper at Miracosta, with Mark Sundin, who's also a writer. He wrote The Man Who Quit Money and a few other good books. We haven't seen each other in ages, but we're aware of each other.
So you go to UCSD. You've kind of you're getting your surf fix, blacks, etc., and then you're studying German lit, and then you move not long after to Berlin. If I've got this right.
No, I studied for a year in Germany while I was in college, but and that was in Munich. But I didn't move to Berlin until I was about 34, 35.
Okay.
I was married for a while in San Francisco, and when that marriage fell apart, I moved to Berlin. And then I stayed for over 10 years. If you minus the time that I was in Somalia, then it's about an even decade in Berlin. But I was based in Berlin for 12, 13 years.
Why Berlin?
I knew that I loved it as a city, and when I decided I couldn't live in San Francisco anymore, then I had to make a decision. And I had, like I said, I had a German passport, so I decided to use it. That seemed to be the right time to do it, and I was right. It was a great time to live in Berlin, first of all, and second, it's still a great city, and I still have a foothold there. I still have an apartment there, so I think it was better to do that earlier rather than later.
And were you surfing while you were in Germany?
Yeah, so if you live in Berlin, which is landlocked, you can't just go out for a surf, but you can go surfing like you go skiing. I mean, you can get on a train or a plane and go somewhere. And it's not the worst thing in the world to have to go to Portugal or to have to go to Morocco or Spain to get your surfing in.
Yeah.
And I figured out pretty quickly that there was a surf scene in Germany, namely down in Munich in the river. And that was the beginning of the project that became Sweetness and Blood. So that's how how it occurred to me to start writing about surfing outside of California.
Right.
Or write about surfing in general. I think if I had stayed in California, I wouldn't have written about surfing quite so much.
Yep. So Sweetness in Blood for our listeners, not just the book itself, but I'm imagining writing the proposal of the book.
That was fun.
Yes. So what was that you have this idea? Run us through this.
Well, the first thing that I noticed about Germany is that it had a surf culture, and it was based. It was up on the North Sea coast, but it was also based around this ridiculous little river wave in the Isar River system, actually in the Eisbach in Munich. The Eisbach is just a little canal. And I thought, okay, well, that's funny. And I went down and tried it and wrote a piece about it for The Atlantic and so on. And then I wondered, well, how did it start? Because I grew up partially in Redondo Beach, and famously George Freeth landed in Redondo and wound up bringing surfing wholesale to the United States. He's only the most famous guy who brought it over. He's probably not even the first one, but he's the pioneer. And I thought, well, you know what? Every nation on earth that has any kind of a surf scene has a story like that. They're going to have a George Freeth, who's either the real or the mythical surf pioneer. And I had recently been to Indonesia, but it hadn't even occurred to me to ask those questions. When I did, it turned out the story was interesting. The guy who brought it there was not Australian; he was American. But then the Australians established it. The Australians came quickly afterwards, and Dorian Paskowitz was just at that time giving free surfboards to Palestinians who wanted to surf in Gaza. So that was an active story, and I thought, that's got to be interesting. And it turns out that Dorian Paskowitz was also the surf pioneer in Israel, also an American. So a story started to gather that was not just about surfing's roots in Hawaii, which are all important, but also about the spread of American pop culture after World War II, which turns out to be another leg in the story. Because I think if it had not taken root in Southern California, where there was all kinds of engineering and inventiveness, then it wouldn't have become a modern sport so quickly, and it wouldn't have become, cheesy and trendy the way it did in the 50s and 60s. And that's what accounted for a large part of the explosion around the world. And then on top of that, the fascinating part of writing Sweetness and Blood was learning how many cultures have some kind of a surf element. Even if stand-up surfing more or less belongs to Hawaiian culture or Polynesian culture, there are lots of cultures up and down the African coast, up and down the South American coast, where basically fishing communities learned to ride waves in one shape or another. And it was, I went to Sao Tome in West Africa, where the fishing communities, the kids in those fishing communities had been riding on their bellies for centuries, probably for years, longer than anyone I talked to could remember. They just sort of threw their hands over their shoulders and went, for a long time. But then when they saw some guys, I think Sam George came out and rode on their feet, they started to do it too. They started to cut longer boards out of their father's canoes and ride on their feet. And it's not that we introduced that to them. They already had a surfing culture. But they, at least in recent years, they found a new way to do it. All that is fascinating to me. And so it became a travel book, not just about surfing, but also about the spread of American culture, the spread of Polynesian culture, which in some ways is more important. I learned that what Europe took away from Polynesian cultures was crucial in the 1700s to some very important political movements, including the French Revolution. So this influence of Polynesian culture really loosened white people up in a really important way. And the fact that people took to surfing so naturally all around the world in a way that is rivaled only by soccer or by football is really interesting and I think really important.
In writing the book, did you travel to all the places?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So each chapter is about one particular carefully chosen country. I tried not to be too obvious. On the other hand, I tried to give a sense of how surfing had spread since its pop culture explosion in the United States. Because that's the most recent wave. All the other stories were a little bit incidental to that story of how, first of all, Polynesia affected Europe and the West, and then how Western pop culture affected places that otherwise would not have a surf culture at all, like Morocco.
Yeah.
And that influence of the West on Morocco and also Japan, especially after World War II, it's essential to understanding, the modern world, I think. So.
We write book proposals, we share them with our agents or editors, and they're this idea that we build from. But then usually when you turn in your manuscript, some new stuff has come up. What was the most surprising thing? I mean, what was in terms of your sort of thesis, or what the argument you wanted to make, or the point you wanted to make, versus like however long it took you to write it in the end? Was there something that surprised you?
Oh, everything surprised me. Every time I went to a new country, I learned things especially about local development of surf culture, that I had no way of learning before I went. I went surfing in the Gaza Strip, and in Israel and in Gaza, what they know about is that this is local knowledge that isn't necessarily general. That even before Dorian Paskowitz arrived with a fiberglass surfboard and introduced the lifeguards at Tel Aviv to the idea of standing on a surfboard, there was something called a chasake, which is a stand-up paddleboard that fishermen they all say on the Arab side developed. So long before Israel was there were fishermen in the waves that took out these leaf-shaped boards that were paddled standing up. And chasake is an Arabic word, and that's a perfect example of local surf culture that nobody really thinks about.
What about where have you had your best surf experiences around the world?
I would so privately, just in Costa Rica, I think. Where else? Also here in California. I mean, my God, when I was surfing at Black's Beach. But also Morocco. Morocco was really terrific. I remember a place south of Casablanca called Les Tomates. And I'm sure I got lost trying to find it. And I was probably not specifically at Les Tomates, but I was near some places that were growing tomatoes in greenhouses near the cliffs. So it was pretty close. And the waves at the base of the cliffs were huge and also rolling, very soft and very gentle. It was nice.
Nice. Where does surfing fit into your life now?
Well, I live in Redondo Beach, so I can surf a couple times a week if I want to, 2 or 3 times, whenever the waves are good. It's very, first of all, I love to do it. Second, it was very important in the process of recovery from Somalia. I wrote The Desert and the Sea while I was still living in Berlin. So I didn't get to surf very often. But when I did, I noticed that I just felt better in a way that didn't deteriorate. I didn't move back from those moments. There was no backsliding for some reason. You just felt better in your head and in your body. Even now, whatever might be going on, every surfer knows this, but you go into the water, you feel rotten, you come out feeling great.
Yeah.
So that's still really important. But just the idea of following the rhythm of the ocean, because I live near it, is really important.
You've done some work with surf therapy, right?
Yes, also. So there's a foundation in Manhattan Beach called the Jimmy Miller Foundation, and I had a relationship with them before I went to Somalia. I knew Jimmy Miller, as a matter of fact. It's named after a guy I went to high school with who was a great surfer who killed himself in 2004, and his parents set up this foundation. I know the Miller family well now, and in the meantime, especially after I got out of Somalia, the classes that they give in something called surf therapy have only become more important. They started to, I will write about this in a future book at some point too, but they started to help Marines at the Wounded Warrior Battalion based in Camp Pendleton, the Wounded Warrior Battalion West, recover from whatever they were going through. Anybody with either physical disabilities or, frankly, PTSD could sign up for these surf lessons. And the Jimmy Miller Foundation would go down onto the base, teach some Marines to surf, and then sit in a circle and talk about it. And it turns out to be incredibly therapeutic, either because you're out in the water or because you're paddling strenuously, or because surfing is just fantastic. There is some science behind surf therapy, but I think just generally, if you're inclined that way to be in the water and to stand on a board, then surfing just is fantastic for your body and mind. And so one way of giving back in some small way to the military community is for me to go down there with the Jimmy Miller people and teach some Marines how to surf.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. I've found, you talk about surfing as therapy, there's a thing that you get, it's almost a lesson that's being taught to you as you're doing it in the ocean, which is be like water and the flow and the easy and the levity in some way, the kind of effervescence of like being out frolicking on the waves.
Yeah. Well, surfing is unique because, first of all, once you're in the water, you have to move. So it's always bad for somebody who's in a bad mental state to just lie on the couch. So if you go out and you move your body, especially in the water, which I think is therapeutic on its own, if you get out and move, you're going to be in better shape. However, against the ocean, you can't impose your will. So you have to find this balance of being strong and being vigorous, but also allowing the ocean to do what it's going to do and working with those incredible currents that are much stronger than you are. That's a very interesting balance that you have to strike when you're either on a surfboard or just out in the ocean that maybe no other sport has. I think, of course, every other sport, you need to find a certain equilibrium and you need to find, a groove. But that balance between your own personal strength and observing the strength of nature is all important in surfing. And it's just my, personal idea that that's one thing that makes it very therapeutic.
Well, it's been a lot of fun talking.
It's been terrific. Thank you, Jamie.
Yeah, thank you, Michael.
Soundings is produced by me, Jamie Brisick, and Jonathan Shiflett. You can find it on Apple, Stitcher, and Spotify. Our theme song is Ohana by Farmer Dave and the Wizards of the West. Soundings is brought to you by the Surfer's Journal, a reader-supported publication made possible by sponsorship from Birdwell, FCS, Patagonia, Rainbow, Vans, Vissla, and Yeti. The Surfer's Journal is published bi-monthly. If you haven't done so yet, I encourage you to visit surfersjournal.com and subscribe. Thank you for listening to Soundings, and until next time.